The battle was fierce in the battlefield, and the enemy was gaining ground against them. Many of their men wounded, others fallen. Even the king himself was stricken. He feared for the army and for his city, that the enemy should prevail and invade against it, and his army destroyed. Now there was a woman in the city who was known and renowned for her gift, but that was in a time past. Now she just labored as other women in the washings and scrubbings and other duties to sustain herself. The king decided she was what they needed at this moment. Well, her gift anyway, for they had tried with their own strength and might. But now their hope was in something greater. Only something beyond the physical ability would help them, to deliver them from the enemy that had proven fierce and mighty than they, even according to the aftermath of that day. So the king sent forth men to fetch her. They found her at the waterpress, washing garments. Around her some women all knelt and scrubbing away on the wet surface. And they grabbed her and took her, saying to her, "The king wants you in the battlefield." And she yelled and argued with them, even as they took her. She tried to reason with them, saying,
"What exactly would a woman, like me, be doing in the battlefield? I am just a washer and a cleaner. What have I done? Why am I being punished?"
But they responded to her not, but just kept focused on the way to the battlefield, to where the king was camped. And they got there, and threw her forth to the ground before the king. She then collected herself, looking at those men with wonder for their cruelty. Then she looked forth while yet on the ground, there out before the king's habitation, and behold, the king stood before her, surrounded by his guard, and behind them the army of thousands was in battle. Then she glanced at the king, and lo, he was wounded, and this struck her. So she rose up, dashing towards the king for his wound, saying,
"Oh, my king, you are wounded."
But one of the guards held her hand just before she had laid them on the king and stopped her. The king then said, "Worry not about me, woman. Can you sing?" he asked. And for a moment she gazed perturbed at the question, wondering what relation there was between singing and the battle. And the king noted the hesitation and asked again, "Can you sing?" This time a dreadful sharpness to his voice, and she almost shook off her feet. But she said,
"Yes, I can. I used to, but it has been a while since."
Then the king said, "Good," and turned away, departing from her. He now looked forth at his army in the battlefield. Just as she tried to follow and ask what it was she was to do, a hand snapped before her, knocking her to the ground. Then another one of the guards threw the instrument that should amplify her voice next at her on the ground, gazing at her, then turned away. Still in confusion, looking now at the instrument, it appeared more familiar than she would have hoped. Then a voice said to her, "Just worship." It was a mighty voice, great and stern. It had shaken her heart and the reins of her being. She quickly looked in the king's direction, for she thought he had spoken it. But the king was a distance away, busy looking forth to his army from this raised ground, and realized that the king would not have said it. So she looked to where the voice actually came from. She looked above. It seemed that only she had heard that voice, for the commotion around her and in the battlefield still went on. The voice said, "Remember how it was. Remember how it used to be." And she knew. The Lord has spoken to her. Suddenly she felt a great strength, even a reassuring come upon her, and she stood, took the instrument, closed her eyes, and remembered. All this time the king and his guard had looked away and on to the battlefield. The fierce battle raged on. The king hoped for a miracle. Then she began to worship, and suddenly there was a gladness upon the heart of the king, and upon the hearts of everyone with him, even as they listened to her sing. Suddenly the clouds started to gather and thicken, and become gray. And those in the field that were injured began to recover from their wounds, and rise, and the army that had been fighting becoming all the more strengthened. But them that were fallen, the dead, still slept, and did not come to life. But yet their wounds healed, and to them, whose parts were severed from them, these parts came back and rejoined to them. Well, At least they would rest in peace and in one piece. The wound of the king had vanished, and there appeared like a glowing countenance about him, as well as the woman, who also seemed transfigured. Even her raiment was transformed. She appeared as though being lifted amid ground. Tears had been flowing upon her face, even as the intensity of the worship increased. She appeared to them as though an angel, and her singing seemed amplified by something supernatural, greater than they had expected from the instrument. And everyone in the battlefield heard her song. There was thunder in the clouds, and a lightning struck. Suddenly, a great fear and dread came upon the armies of the enemy, and they now ceased to fight. Something was even overtaking the ground beneath their feet. The Lord God was fighting for these people, they feared. So they began to flee, and the king lifted up his valiant sword and declared, "Charge after them!" And they all charged, even the king in his chariot, his valiant army horse charging straight forth, and his guard. The victory was assured, and what a mighty victory it was. Now, even in accordance to the things of the Spirit of God gifts believers differently, with weapons that would well be efficient in battle, and the weapon that would be most efficient in battle for one believer might be different from another's, even as the Spirit of God has gifted them. To one it might be the word, or prophecy, to another prayer and speech in an unknown tongue, yet to another song. And if the believer would use that gift granted to them through which it was appointed for them to war, then there is great victory, even against the forces of darkness. And in every way the Lord God is mighty and is to be worshipped, the victory assured, even as we worship him in truth and in spirit.